Well, thank you very much, Naboyit, for this introduction, and also thanks to Jan for the for organizing this digital meeting. I'm also very honored to be the last one of this series. Indeed, I think it was 10 months ago. It should have been a conference in person, but finally, of course, like many things, pandemic has chosen otherwise. So, I'm very glad that finally we could have this lecture, and also I'm very happy to be part of this Joseph C. Miller Memorial Lecture Series. I only met Joe Miller once in Sweden, but he was very kind. He was very interested in my work, so you were very a fond memory of this. Yeah. So today I will talk about two things in particular. So changes in the enslavement methods on Madagascar. That's the first part, and the second part will be on the slavery in the Mascarenes, especially Malagasy slaves that arrived there. So mostly during the 18th century, but we will also cross chronologic boundaries a bit. So I would like to start with a small anecdote. So imagine ourselves in the Dutch Cape colonies in 1766. The VOC ship, the Meermin, has just suffered from a slave revolt when it was returning from Madagascar to the Cape. And the revolt has been quelled, and one of the leaders, Masavana, has been tried before the court of justice there, and so he's interrogated, and they ask him about, how did you become a slave? And he explains that, I had on fine cloths with gold and silver on my body, and was invited by the king of Tuléar to go with him aboard the ship that brought me here to see what she was like, which I did. And about halfway there, the king had me tied up, took my gold, silver, and cloth for my body, and sold me to that vessel as a slave. So I think this anecdote really puts us directly in the changes that occurred in the enslavement methods, especially the impact that the European slave trade had on these changes. We see here that someone which has rather high status would eventually could end up as a slave, as in this case, and that it was mostly due to the fact that they could obtain important goods, merchandise in exchange for slaves, that they were incited to do this. But we have very rare examples of, what are the origins of slaves? How did they become enslaved? And it is only those few passages in VOC ship's journals, Compagnie des Indes ship's journals, that we can get a glimpse of how the hundreds and thousands of Malagasy slaves that were traded were enslaved during this period. So just on slavery on Madagascar, very briefly. So slavery has existed as an institution from the very beginning that Madagascar was populated. It was only very lately that the island was inhabited, only from the somewhere in the first millennium onwards, by different waves of immigrants, which directly, in fact, took this institution with them, adopted it, and it was, of course, transformed a bit by the subsequent slave trade that existed. And I like to make the difference here between slaves that are really destined to be exported, which are only enslaved because they want to sell them abroad, which are the so-called export slaves, which are strangers in those communities. And on the other hand, we have the domestic slaves, which are more a part of the family, family members in this society, and they have they are in the first place not meant to be sold outside, but things might change over time, of course. So those are the two groups that I will talk about here. And in the beginning, before the European slave trade really took off, these domestic slaves, the number of domestic slaves was enough, in fact, to satisfy the demand that existed. That a very small demand that existed was enough, so it wasn't necessary to create export slaves in the beginning of the slave trade. But soon, when the European slave trade took off, Malagasy traders, the sovereign who were selling the slaves, had to become inventive. So they would sell any person they could get their hands off in order to sell them as slaves. And we see here that domestic slaves that try to protect themselves from this possibility to be sold outside of the domain of the king. For example, in 1762, the Dutch relate that all the slaves in the kingdom deserted by fear of being transported outside of the country. So even the arrival of a vessel at the coastline could incite fear on those domestic slaves, fear that they could be sold outside of their homelands. So how did Malagasy become slaves? Of course, there were different factors that played roles here. For the domestic slaves, there were mostly endogenous factors. So, of course, birth was important. But we have justice and debt. So justice means that any crime could be punished by enslavement. And in the case of debt, if the debtor was unable to solve his debt, he could risk losing his freedom. While the exogenous factors were much more used for export slaves, especially violence, so warfare, razzias, raiding was very important during the period of the European slave trade. But also other factors like hunger, natural catastrophes could force families into selling some of their children, some of their family members, in order to be able to remain alive. And tributes also become important, especially with the creation of the centralized states, who could impose their tributes upon their neighboring communities, especially because they were less powerful. Before moving on the slave trade, just some examples of the enslavement methods, just to get a bit into the subject and to see, what kind of information do we get from sources on enslavement methods, especially, as I told you, ship's journals are very important here, but still there are really only a dozen examples where we clearly see written, this person was enslaved through this and this method. So we have two examples from 1699. Most come from the VOC reports. So in one case, a certain Raumbo was a slave that had been taken prisoner by the son of Andriamandi Suarivu, so the son of the Sakalava king, one of the most important sovereigns of the island in the 17th century. And another example, a certain Reinevau was caught while he was walking freely and sold as a slave, which seems to be rather difficult to really comprehend what they mean by caught while he was walking freely, but it seems to be that he might have been kidnapped and subsequently sold, something that happened very often in the countryside. And another example here, which is also of interest, comes from a few years earlier, 1686, when the VOC ship Yambi witnessed how the sovereign of Winnie Bay, victorious in battle, took no less than 300 of their enemies as slaves, although all of them elderly people and children who had been unable to flee. So we see another important proof that warfare existed in order to obtain slaves. But of course, in this case, we see that there are mostly slaves that are little interest for Europeans, who are always looking for young male slaves, because there are only those who cannot flee that are enslaved. In the 18th century, we see more warfare coming really towards the coastline, and in this case also the raiding. This passage is very interesting from the French commander of Sainte-Marie on the east coast of Madagascar. He states that the chief of Angari, the Madagascar, begged him to buy a small boy and a small girl if presented. They were free and were abducted in the countryside, and he thinks that the thieves took them to Full Point to sell them in trade. But the ship has already left on the same day as the abduction, so he fears they took them to Sainte-Marie when they could not sell them at Full Plant. And indeed, they were presented to him in conformity with the description. So this is another passage that clearly shows that individuals, free individuals, were abducted, were kidnapped in order to be sold as slaves, which is even confirmed by one of the most important sovereigns, the Sakara sovereign, who states that it was customary among the Malagasy that every prisoner taken by the enemy was made a slave and sold. So subjects that are free today could be taken by an opposed party and sold outside of his domain. And of course, this sovereign could not answer for an evil he cannot prevent. So this shows that it was really something that was rather common during this period. But how did the slave trade impact this situation? So the slave trade in Madagascar was very diverse, very large in compared to the Atlantic slave trade. We see here that it concerned the entire Indian Ocean region. The yellow lines represent the ancient routes that existed for centuries before, used by Swahili merchants to East Africa and by Arab and Gujarati merchants to the Arabian Peninsula and to the Indian subcontinent. The red lines represent the VOC, the Dutch shipping routes, slave voyages. Most of them went to Cape Town, so Dutch Cape Colony, but others also went to other places, especially Sumatra, where there was gold mining going on. But in volume, it was not that important, only 77 slaving voyages. The English also took slaves even to the New World, so slaves were taken to Barbados and to Virginia. But the most important slave trades took place around these two tiny islands, the French Mascarene Islands. And of course, Madagascar was an important slaving reservoir because of its proximity to these islands. And there were, I found, 1771 slaving expeditions, which might have traded between 137,000 and 201,000 slaves. And we see here that there's a clear exponential increase in this period between 1718 and 1810. And yeah, this has, of course, an important impact on slavery on Madagascar. And to imagine a bit how this was organized, so ships departed from either La Réunion, Île Bourbon here on the left, and Mauritius, Île-de-France to the right, with a cargo of firearms, gunpowder, Mexican silver, Indian cloth, and arak, locally produced alcohol. With this cargo, they went mostly to the east coast of Madagascar, but they could also go to anywhere where slaves were available. And when they arrived there, and this is an important point, they did not only bought slaves there, did not only buy slaves there, but also cattle and rice. Why? Because the slaves that were employed on the Mascarenes also had to eat. And so they took this food with them to be able to feed the slaves, the ever-increasing number of slaves in the colonies. And of course, even though the crossing was rather short, only 1 to 2 weeks, there was always the risk of mortality and slave revolts. So I've tried here a bit to phase this slave trade. I've tried to divide it in 3 phases. First, a period before 1670, when mostly the Europeans were not really involved in this commerce. So the enslavement methods remained rather traditional, but this changed from 1670 onwards up until 1750. There were mostly the Dutch and the English that were involved, together with the pirates that came to Madagascar during this period. And we see here that this period coincided with the creation of the centralized communities and the organization of military expeditions in order to get slaves. And the last phase, just before the islands, the Mascarenes, were captured by the British in 1810, the French really dominated the slave trade. And we see that there were individual raiding going on to the interior, but mostly the intra-Malagasy slave trade elemented the French demand. So to get a bit more into the details, so the first phase is, I think, a rather interesting phase, because when the Europeans arrived for the first time in Madagascar, there are very few mentions of slaves. So the prices of slaves are rather low, especially compared, for example, with the price of livestock. One beef was about 10 times more expensive than a slave in the 17th century, and this situation was completely the opposite in the 18th century, when a slave became 10 times more expensive than a beef. So this shows that at the beginning, when the Europeans arrived there, slavery and slave trade was not that important in Madagascar. For example, instead of enslaving prisoners of war were mostly killed because they did not see any use to keeping them as slaves. So when the first Europeans arrived there in the 1640s, in order to get slaves, they were a bit surprised that it was difficult to get slaves, and that the Malagasy did not even propose slaves to them to be bought. So, for example, the Dutch slaving voyages were rather unsuccessful until the Dutch discovered the northwest coast in 1676. So the northwest coast is really the exception on Madagascar. Why? Because it has been connected with these ancient maritime trading routes for centuries before the arrival of the Europeans. So there was a local supply of slaves, and who were sold. For example, several thousand slaves were sold every year to the Swahili and Gujarati merchants. So the Europeans could easily tap into this already existing slave trade. But at the same time, the other regions became aware of the possibility to sell slaves to the Europeans, and this had important consequences to the political and economic factors of the island. So in the second phase, we see that the demand for slaves rises. So instead of only having the demand of the Asian and African traders, suddenly we also have this demand of Dutch and English slave traders, which is a powerful incentive to the creation of centralized states. So, for example, the Sakalava come from the interior, and during the 1660s, they tried to capture one of the slaving ports of one of the ports, for example, Morondave on the western coast. And this gave them direct access to maritime trade. At first, English ships went there just to obtain cattle, but suddenly they saw that it was possible to obtain slaves at a very low price compared to the slaves in West Africa. So they would send slave ships, in order to obtain slaves. And Sakalava continued to expand their kingdom up until up to the northwest coast. So this important slave trading port of Boigny Bay, which they captured in the 1680s. So from that moment on, the western coast of Madagascar was completely dominated by the Sakalava, who controlled the most important slaving ports. and they controlled thus the slave trade with the Dutch and the English. And in order to be able to satisfy the demand, they organized military expeditions. On the other end of the island, so on the northeast coast, pirates started to install themselves on St. Maria's Island. They were chased from the Atlantic region, so they installed themselves in the Indian Ocean. And there they became the brokers between, for example, the English planters in Barbados and Virginia asking for cheap slaves, and the local sovereigns who saw that, hey, we can sell slaves and get a huge profit from it. So they installed themselves there, and this started the creation of another powerful community, the Betsini-Saraka community. And so during this period, most of the slaves were supplied through military expeditions, specifically organized to answer the increased demand by European traders. And the third phase was really when the slave trade took off, but it also corresponded to the breakdown of these very young centralized states. So in the 1750s, in both the Sakalava and the Betsini-Saraka case, there was a problem of succession. So there are important civil wars that took place, which increased the insecurity, not only within these regions, but also outside of these regions, which increased the risk of raiding and the risk of free individuals being captured and being enslaved. We see here one witness in 1763 who says that this island is today completely at war at the coast which we visit, and where there are not enough slaves to provide entire cargoes of slaves as before. Every ship that goes in search of rice and cattle only obtains 15 to 20 slaves after a long time. And what slaves? The elderly, women, and children, who have a very hard time completing our cargo. Here we have another reference to the fact that even though military expeditions are launched, even though that is the case, most of the time these expeditions only come back with slaves that are not of much interest to the Europeans, who are always in search of young male slaves. So the French, who try to control the slave trade because they are dependent on the arrival of slaves in the Mascarenes to keep these colonies running, they decided to install themselves permanently on the coastline, so on the northeast coast, around Sainte-Marie and Full Point. And they try to intervene in the civil wars in order to obtain more slaves. And this increased demand really is an important factor during this period, because it's in some way leads to the rise of the Merina kingdom. So that is the third important element of this phase. The Merina kingdom was the kingdom in the highlands, in the interior, and they were supplying the coastline with slaves from their own kingdom. But they lacked access to the sea, and in order to be able to get their hands on firearms and other important products, they supplied the coastline, which could no longer supply the increasing demand of the French. They started to dominate the supply of slaves to the coastline to the French. So by the 1770s, 2/3 of the Malagasy slaves traded to the French was originated from this landlocked interior kingdom. And as we see in this passage, Narcisse, a Malagasy slave, explained that he was a native of a part of Malgache called Amboui-Mene, and that he was seized by the soldier of King Anglien Nampoin, father of King Radam, and he was sold at Tananarive to a white named Le Sieur Jacques Fromlot, who led the informant with many slaves to the coast at Thomasin, Tamata, where he was detained 3 months and finally embarked aboard a ship with 3 masts that carried 300 blacks and 50 negresses. So this really showed the importance that the Merina Kingdom had during this period, during this last phase, and which really shifted the importance from the coastline to the interior, and which just gave way to the rise of the Merina Kingdom, who would replace both the Sakalava kingdoms and the Betsimisaraka kingdoms as the most important political powers in Madagascar from the 19th century onwards. So if we take this all into consideration, what was exactly the impact of the European slave trade? So the most important impact was that the European slave trade increases the demand for slaves. Because of this, the Malagasy had to find more slaves if they wanted to satisfy this demand. And as early as 1753, the Dutch complained that there was a strong trade continued by the English, French, Portuguese, and Moorish vessels. And in our absence, so in the absence of the Dutch, the land has been depleted of slaves who desert the moment they see a ship coming. So in fact, the Dutch here complain about the difficulties to obtain enough slaves because of this huge competition with other nations, and also the complexities of getting enough slaves, because every time there's a European vessel that arrives in this port, the slaves try to run away, and it's very difficult to maintain them. So here we have to grab back to this classic gun slave cycle. We always think that the European slave trade, one of the most important impacts was that it increased violence in the places where they got slaves. So it is true that firearms are important, that they were crucial in imposing the military might of, for example, the Sakalava and Betsimisaraka kingdoms on their neighbors. But we also have to take into account the symbolic value of firearms. Firearms were also a very prestige product, so they were not only used in warfare. And during warfare, it has been shown that they had very low precision. So most of the time, the Malagasy preferred to use their own weapons instead of firearms. So did really the European slave trade increased this violence and increased so the exogenous factors on the islands, and just were these factors really at the basis of these export slaves. So we see, for example, that, and this is an important difference with the Atlantic slave trade, we see that the firearms only took about 27 plus 18%, so not even half of the merchandise used by the French to obtain slaves. So, for example, piastre, the Mexican silver, was more important than firearms in this trade. So that shows that it's not only firearms that were demanded, but also other products. And if we see what the French bought with those products, we see that only half of it was slaves, and the other half is presented by livestock and rice. So even though the slave trade was imported, it was not that important as in, for example, West Africa, where the slaves represented the only product that was obtained at the coastline by the Europeans. So even if we take this in account, we have to see what was the difference. Did the Europeans had more advantage if the Malagasy were at war or if they were at peace? And here it depends on the phase, because I think traditionally we are more inclined to say, well, it's of course in war, because when there's war, the Europeans well, there are prisoners of war, that are captured that can be sold to the Europeans. But the situation is much more complex than this. And here we take really the difference between the second phase and the third phase. So in the second phase, it is important to take into account that there was no permanent trading posts, European trading posts in Madagascar. So in fact, the Malagasy were there, they were waiting for a ship to arrive, and only when a ship arrived, they would take action to obtain slaves or to get their slaves from the interior to the coastline. So they did not have a stock of slaves ready because it could take months for the next ship to arrive. That would be very risky for them. So in fact, they would only organize their military expeditions the moment that they know, hey, there's a ship, there's a sail, there's a Dutch ship coming, we know they want slaves, so we are organizing a military expedition. So violence in this case is best suited for this ad hoc slave demands because it will give you direct access to a slave reservoir. On the other hand, violence means also that, for example, the countryside is really is pillaged. The rice fields are burned, and cattle is also killed. So that is very much not in the interest of, for example, the French in the third phase, who are also looking for rice and cattle to be traded. So if we take a look at the third phase, a Malagasy community which is at peace is much more preferred when a regular slave supply is demanded, because it keeps, for example, the trade routes open to the interior, trade routes that are crucial in obtaining slaves, because we have seen in the third phase, the interior supplied 2/3 of the slaves sold to the French. So we see here that it's somewhere, it's kind of contradictory, but if we take a look at the second phase, it's really violence that's dictated. So the exogenous factors that created these export slaves. But in the third phase, we see, of course, violence remains important, especially with the razzias, with the insecurity. But the French really preferred that there was peace, especially at the coastline, in order to be able to continue to trade with the interior. And this anecdote really underlines this fact, because the French states in the 1780s that the natives of the province of Fulpointe, who trafficked in the interior with the project of selling their slaves to our traitants, seeing the war ignited, did not sell them and kept what they had for the exchanges that the war could sell them required. At the same time, at that time, there were no longer any slaves from the interior, nor from the province of Fulpointe, and such who, before the war, had not a single one to whom the fate has given did not think of selling them. By this, that they had become useful for them in the service of their family. So in fact, when there's war, they do not prefer to sell their domestic slaves, and they would only sell their export slaves. So we see that changes really were important and occurred during this period, and that the European slave trade really had a huge impact on the enslavement methods on Madagascar, and in fact dictated the creation of the centralized state, the political and economic power of the individual communities was very much dependent on how a community could get access to slaving ports, could get access to the merchandise sold by the Europeans. So we see that this has a huge impact, and that it's influenced, for example, the insecurity of the countryside, but also the warfare and also the justice system, because we see that criminals that would have been killed for their crimes before the arrival of the European slave trade would be much more enslaved afterwards in order to be able to sell them and to get profit from them. So in fact, the justice system is used and abused by the sovereigns in order to get their hands on slaves. So this was the part on the enslavement methods on Madagascar. And now I will get to the part of slavery in the Mascarenes. And really, I think this is interesting to see what the Malagasy slaves had were different from other slaves there. First, we see, well, that the number of slaves really increased over time, especially from the 1717 onwards. So, in fact, the Malagasy slaves only made out about 40–30% of all the slaves on the island. So, in fact, the East African slaves became much more important from the 1770s onwards. So that explains the increase of numbers. And by the end of the French period in 1810, there were more than 100,000 slaves on those two tiny islands. And slavery at the Mascarenes was mostly like in the Caribbean, turned around the plantations. And which was very much the exception in the Indian Ocean world. So most of the Indian Ocean was not at all relied not at all on the plantation economy. Slaves were mostly used in domestic services, in the building of fortifications, or in mining, for example, as I said, in the VOC case of Salida. But the Mascarenes, the French Mascarenes, were really the typical tropical plantation economy that we see in the Caribbean. And the French Mascarenes in particular, this is a table from 1803. We can see that sugar became very important in this period, so at the beginning of the 19th century, with 6 to 8 million francs that was produced. But still, café, so coffee, was really the most important. In the entire 18th century, La Réunion, Île Bourbon was the most important coffee producer, one of the most important coffee producers in the French Empire. And on the other hand, we also see cotton, indigo, and girofle that are also important, but the economy mostly turned around sugar and coffee. And so Malagasy slaves were an important part of this. And of course, they were, very much in this traditional framework of the French slavery in the colonies. We have the Code Noir from 1685, which was very much the basics of this framework. And of course, and this is, I think, interesting, because of the proximity of Madagascar, slaves always try to get back. And if they try to get away and they were caught, of course, there were different punishments that were there. We have the classical punishments with flogging, but especially marronnage was very heavily punished. For example, the first time someone tried to get away, they had their tendon, I'm not sure how to say it in English, they cut, so they could not move, in fact. And by the third time they tried to flee the plantation, they would be put to death, sentenced to death. So they were really very crucial, very cruel punishments in those colonies, which were also the same in the Mascarenes. Traditionally we always think of the Mascarenes that they were a bit apart. They were in the Indian Ocean. The situation for the slaves was not as cruel as in the Caribbean, but in fact the situation was exactly the same. The only difference was that the Mascarenes had a society that also consisted for important part of free Malagasy that came from Madagascar to work, for example, as free laborers in the French Mascarene. So in fact, free Malagasy and enslaved Malagasy lived very closely in the same colonial society of the French Mascarene Islands. So an important part here was marronage. And here I will get into marronage by the Malagasy slaves. So marronage is in fact the fact to flee the plantation. And well, there were two possibilities. One was to go to the interior of the island, so the mountains. And this often happened very quickly after the arrival of the slaves. Sometimes only a few weeks after their arrival. And there is a difference between marronage, which was individual, and marronage en masse, which could include multiple slaves. And the advantage that the Malagasy had was that even though it didn't matter from what region of Madagascar they came, they all had the same language, the same culture, the same background. So in fact, they had this very very big advantage over, for example, East African slaves, that they could easily communicate together, and they did also. And we have multiple cases where Malagasy would engage in this marronage en masse in large groups to go to the interior to organize themselves and to resist capture by the French from the interior. So this is if they decided to stay on the island. The other possibility was to go back to Madagascar. As I said, Madagascar and the Mascarenes are very close. It's only 1 or 2 weeks of sailing. So they always try to get back there. One French planter described that Malagasy slaves say that they know exactly where Madagascar is, and they can even point out the islands, as we can see in this citation. And the fear among the planters was this big that there were many regulations against using Malagasy slaves as rowers or as sailors, and to have colonists chain up their boats in order to make it more difficult for Malagasy to get their hands on them and to flee to their homelands. But in some cases, they managed to get back, but that did not mean that if they get back, they would get their freedom. Because in 1759, for example, the French governor of the Mascarenes say that these miserables, when they arrived, finally back in Madagascar, they were on the spot stripped and returned to slavery, from which they wanted to deliver themselves by their escape. So in fact, even if they managed to get back to Madagascar, they were immediately enslaved and sold to the French. So there was no, it was very difficult to remain free, even though we have some isolated cases, like in 1752, when a runaway slave from the Mascarenes was encountered in St. Augustine Bay. But there could be even more, the outcome could be even more tragic, like in 1790, when a French vessel finds a canoe with 26 runaway slaves that died from inanition. So this is one of the risks. And the organization of this Malagasy case was really exceptional. I've found one case where the Malagasy slaves managed to organize themselves, even though they came from different parts of the island. We see here that it concerns nearly 20 slaves that came from very different plantations of the islands. They managed to organize themselves to meet up in this district at a certain time, and to capture one of the canoes, and to get in the open sea. And unfortunately for them, they didn't arrive at Madagascar, but while they escaped Île-de-France, they arrived on La Réunion. So they arrived in the other French colony, where they were either killed or captured, and of course sent back to Île-de-France. But this is a very interesting case, because we know nothing about the communication between the slaves, how they were able to for example, voyage between the plantation, but this clearly shows that they could not only communicate together, they could even organize something that complex as this escape attempt, which again was probably only possible because they were Malagasy, because they could communicate together, and probably they were even originated from the same community before they were captured, because we also found 3 married couples in this group of attempted escapees. And we see the same degree of organizations during slave revolts. And we have the one case, as I started with the Meermin, we should also end with the Meermin, which is the very famous slave revolt case on the VOC ship in 1766. So this ship set sail from Madagascar with around 120 slaves aboard. And the Dutch captain did a very strange thing. He decided to put a group of Malagasys on deck and to give them some weapons to clean, because then they had something to do. So the Malagasy, instead of just cleaning the weapons, they used the weapons to gain control of the ship. And in gaining control of the ship, they forced the Dutch to set sail back to Madagascar. But because the Malagasy, unfortunately, did not have any navigational experience, the Dutch continued their way to Cape Colony, where the ship stranded a couple of miles from Cape Colony, and the Malagasy slaves who thought that they arrived in Madagascar were welcomed when they disembarked by a party of VOC soldiers, and so they were either killed or recaptured and sold at Cape Town. So this the only example of a successful slave revolt that we have in the Dutch case, and it also clearly illustrates, I think, the capacity of Malagasy slaves to be able to resist and organize themselves, because the percentage of slave revolts in the Madagascar slave trade is 2 times as important as in the transatlantic slave trade. So that's one of the clear proofs that their ability, I think, to communicate together was of great importance. So I will stop here just to remind you, well, this research is really based on archival research. I put some of the most important archives that I consulted here. So yeah, I hope that you enjoyed it, and if there are any questions, of course, feel free to ask. And thank you very much for your time.